I thank you so much for being here, for getting out of your comfort zone and from your desks, beds, wherever you may be working from home, to actually be in this room with us today to help launch this report that we've just released. But also an equally warm welcome to all of you tuning in online through Asia Society's YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter accounts. Very much appreciate your interest in this report and in the issues that we'll be discussing around this report. We're also very fortunate today to have with us Ms. Kathleen McGowan from the Digital Impact Alliance.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
And Dr. Ranjit Singh, who should be tuning in. He's actually on standby. He's coming in to us on Zoom from New York.
Hello, everyone. Just wanted to say hi.
Hi, Ranjit. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in DC with all of you.
No, that's fine. Thank you for even giving your time. And I will make sure that both Kay and Ranjit get a proper introduction before we get to the panel discussion. But to start off today's event, Mark, my co-author of this report, and myself will talk a little bit about the report subject, how we got to some of the recommendations that we have in the report. Some of you I see already flipping through it. That's good news. The report is also available online on Asia Society Policy Institute's website. We just made that live a half an hour ago. So if you're interested, it's available on mobile version as well. So feel free to use your phones to check that out. But those of you with a print copy, you'll see that right in the middle of the report, there is a special section called a policy playbook, which basically bridges the two subjects of data and AI that are interlinked. And so you have kind of a conceptual as well as a visual connector between these two subjects. We go into 5 countries for each data and AI. Those 5 countries in Southeast Asia that we delve a little deeper into are Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. So all in, there are 10 chapters, 5 chapters each for these countries on data and AI. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the rationale for the project before I hand it over to Mark to talk about the policy recommendations that we've offered for consideration. We offer these policy considerations primarily for those in government, but also to other stakeholders, including civil society organizations and industry players, of course. One of the things that we strongly advocate for in the report is a multi-stakeholder approach. I know this is a buzzword, but we advocate really going beyond what we call the usual suspects. So we talk about involving historians, linguists, anthropologists, cultural activists, even indigenous rights communities and advocates to talk about these issues so that we can all try to think outside the box about these issues that are beginning to increasingly impact our lives on a daily basis more and more, and will continue to do so. So we urge a reframing of the ways that we have been thinking about digital, about data, and about AI beyond the conventional. I know there is a representative from the Australian Embassy here, and I want to express my appreciation to the Australian government for generously funding this project and report. There was complete autonomy in allowing us the freedom to really explore this project, so I really appreciate that. A little bit about some of the underlying premises of this project and the report. So 5 underlying premises, basically. The first is that data is and has always been foundational to industry, and international ties. And this is even truer in the digital age, right? Because yes, data and AI can help grow the economy, can help advance better governance, better administration by public officials, and create a more informed and robust society. But data is and has always been an instrument of power, of influence, and of dominance. And particularly in Southeast Asia, as relatively young post-colonial nations, we know this to be true, though we do not often think of data and technology in that same manner. Underlying premise 2. Now, if Southeast Asian countries don't contribute to the rules that are being shaped around data, around AI now, standard setting, if you don't already know this, is a new theater of geopolitical competition. And if Southeast Asian countries don't at least contribute some of their own perspectives, their own approaches to this developing conversation about normative rules, about standards, whether technical or legal, about laws, then there is a risk of some of these systems, platforms, even the frameworks surrounding data and AI to be very ill-fitting and ill-suited to the local needs and priorities of the very diverse societies in Southeast Asia. You'll see in our report when we go through the different countries that Southeast Asian nations are more than happy to adhere to the prevailing rules surrounding data, surrounding AI. But we think that there should be more to that than just following and adhering. That's just the first step. We should also be helping in the region to evolve some of those norms, to create new rules as we see fit for our needs and our priorities, not just now, but in the next 10 to 50 years even. Which leads me to my third underlying premise. In order to contribute some of these national or even regional perspectives in and from Southeast Asia, there first needs to be a self-awareness and self-assurance about what it is the region or countries in the region really need and want. Right now, a canvassing of the countries in our report shows that there's a lot of exuberance about all things digital, about all things tech. Most of that excitement is geared towards digital economy. Almost, I would argue, solely around the digital economy. But if we take a step back, what is it that we hope to achieve out of this race for digitalization? And we need to ask ourselves, what is it that is the end objective or end goal from this digital transformation initiative that the whole region has embraced? And I don't think that answer is very clear. We all hope to grow our economies. We all hope to have better public services. We all hope to have, again, a more informed and participative society. But we argue in the report that maybe we should be reframing the end goal of digitalization so that the advancement and empowerment of dignity, human dignity, should be that end goal. And if we are leaving out vulnerable communities in each of our nations, then perhaps we need to rethink this focus on the digital economy. Not everyone needs to be, wants to be an entrepreneur on the digital platform. Not everyone can be. And if there are different approaches to how data is conceived, such as amongst indigenous communities, of which there are many in Southeast Asia, then we need to be rethinking how we include those members of our society. Fourth, I promise I'll get through these next two quickly. So again, this necessitates reframing and reconsideration of how it is we think about data and AI and the existing policy frameworks that underline these areas in each of our countries. We've done, I think, a decent job of laying out the policy and legal frameworks in each of the 5 countries that we've covered. But we think perhaps that there should be more of a reflection, a deeper reflection of some of these issues that I raised. Fifth and finally, part of this rethinking and reframing should go beyond modeling some of our laws, some of our policies on matured economies. I think that is the end goal that many governments hope to exemplify. The EU's GDPR that is out there, some of the AI policies that have been put forward both by governments elsewhere as well as private sector, those are very useful, very convenient frameworks that are already out there. And because of this race for everything digital, it's very appealing to basically adopt and adapt. But we need to go back to basics and think about some of these unusual suspects we should be engaging beyond industry, beyond computer scientists, engineers. We should also be thinking again of engaging those in the arts, and that includes the creative arts, but also in the human sciences. Because ultimately, if technology is to serve the human being, then we should be centering that human being and our humanity, as well as human dignity, as a core part of tech. So I'll turn it over to Mark right now to talk a little bit about our policy recommendations, and then we'll have a discussion with both Kay and Ranjit.
Thank you so much, Elina. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity to really write this report. It's been a long time coming. Writing this in sunny Honolulu and reflecting from the part of the region and seeing Southeast Asia and the buzz surrounding technology. And so I think our, why did we come up with the policy playbook? Because how do we raise the standards for AI and data governance? And the policy playbook is our sort of intervention or proposal to that. The policy playbook, as Elina has mentioned, is located at the center of the publication because we see it as a connective tissue between data and AI, because we see Southeast Asia's bullish outlook on data, but also a burgeoning interest in how they are going to frame artificial intelligence. And we see that sort of foundational relationship across our case studies. The principles and the practices sort of both advanced in the policy playbook are a reflection of the empirical evidence that we gathered looking into the unique and distinct perspectives of the 5 country case studies, as well as throughout our stakeholder engagements. And we also note that these principles and practices are also inspired by existing literature, particularly from the social technical approach that advances that human machine and computational interaction that we need, that espouses that holistic development, deployment, and scaling of AI and technology. So I will just run through the 5 sort of principles and also provide a very brief sort of practices that how policymakers in Southeast Asia and beyond can adapt or can use whenever they engaged in capacity building among partner countries. So we start off with agency. Agency is the user's knowledge that data is being collected, stored, managed, but also being deleted. And when it comes to AI, it also pertains to the as Elina has already mentioned, participation of users in the development, deployment, and scaling of AI technologies. Throughout our conversation with various stakeholders in Southeast Asia, we learned that there is not much of a knowledge about the agency of most users, about their capacity or their sort of right to have their data deleted. And this is very apparent with the proliferation of contact tracing apps throughout the pandemic. And now that we're easing, at least as Elina has intimated, into the endemic, hopefully in the endemic stage, what will happen to those data that were collected by contact tracing apps? Do users have the right to demand to their governments that those data need to be deleted? So agency at the heart of that is really not just the ability of users to adhere to these, fine prints of data collection, but also if they have sort of that autonomy or that power to ask their governments, those collecting their data, to delete their data at their discretion. I think in terms of the second one, care. Care is pertains to us. The second principle, care, pertains to having the highest level of standards or safeguards that data sets as well as AI systems are free or at least secure from cyber attacks. And in Southeast Asia, there is this growing penchant for e-commerce. And as we have research in our studies, majority of Southeast Asian economies are comprised of micro, small, medium enterprises who doesn't really have any practical sort of knowledge or application or even budget to acquire cybersecurity services. And this will definitely have a very big impact in Southeast Asia, given that MSMEs are the linchpin of Southeast Asian economy. And so we advocate for a particular practice of building more capacity, not just between the usual public-private partnerships involving large corporations, but also at that level of small to medium enterprises. And we look into plugging in corporate social responsibility as a potential sort of pathway for these companies to provide capacity to MSMEs. Equity is the third principle that talks about more on the heart of this project, which sort of skews the conversation on how does the user really get to be the sort of the benefit of the value extraction of data. And here we propose alternative data governance approaches where, aside from the conventional race to the bottom that we see among all large and multinational or global ICT companies, not just here in the United States, but also the burgeoning unicorns and decacorns in Southeast Asia. How do we conceive of these data being collected by these companies? Do users to really get the most value of these data, not just in terms of marketing and providing you with the best analytics, but also do they really get the end of the bargain if we speak about it? And so we advance this notion of what other alternative data sort of arrangements can users strike with these large, more established tech companies. And I think the fourth principle that we talk about pertains to inclusion. As Elina has mentioned, diversification of perspectives, not just about the mainstream gender of women parity, but also what we found out in one of our case studies in Thailand. There is a growing LGBT community in Thailand that espouses about their rights for data. Are their identities, their sentiments, their feelings, their experiences reflected in these data sets. In Southeast Asia, there's been a lot of talk about gender parity. But there's also this growing conversation about these emerging sort of minorities, such as indigenous people. Are their perspective considered in designing data-driven public policies? And I think the last one principle, the final principle, which also speaks more of the technical aspects of AI and data, is reliability. We've heard about transparency, fairness, accuracy, and all these sort of similar principles to deal with mitigating bias and algorithmic training. But what we advance or put forward is this notion of security. We've heard about security by design a lot in terms of risk assessments and sort of accountability mechanisms and measures. What we put forward here is security by dignity. Security and dignity by design. So it's not just about security anymore, but putting the human dignity at the center of it all. Treating the user or the human subject not just a disembodied consumer of technology, but one that has really agency and autonomy. And all is this to say that, given the growing sort of geotechnological competition in the region, Southeast Asia stands again in the middle, with the ongoing conversation about the bifurcation of global supply chains. I think the policy playbook offers Southeast Asia the power and the agency to decide and carve its own niche in terms of the burgeoning technological terrain that not adhere to the two great powers, but really having that capacity and that toolkit to decide on what their digital future looks like and how are they going to deal with it in terms of their own resources, but also in cooperation with partner countries that are willing to extend capacity building initiatives. But of course, within the remit of these principles that espouses human dignity, fairness, and also equity. So I'll turn back to Elina. Looking forward to the discussions.
Great. Well, hopefully that sparks some thought, provoked some feedback that you may want to provide us with, either here in the room or online. If you're joining us online and you have an intervention to make, whether it's a comment or question, please feel free to do so on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook. We're monitoring those accounts and we'll try to get to your questions as best as we can. If you can hashtag your question or comments, hashtag Asia Society Live, that will help us get to your intervention quickly. So I'm going to turn now to Kay and Ranjit. Let me introduce the both of you first. I briefly introduced you in the beginning. Kathleen McGowan is Senior Director, Research Policy and Advocacy at the Digital Impact Alliance, or DIAL, which is part of the UN Foundation. Kay has a long history as a diplomat and digital development expert. I believe you've served over 2 decades with the US government, working in vulnerable places like Afghanistan and even Haiti. And you've worked on a number of digital financial services partnerships, providing safe and trusted access to that. And you also have a deep expertise in policy in that area. And you've worked on enduring partnerships, including the UN's Better Than Cash Alliance and Smart Africa's peer learning network for data and digital policymakers. Thank you for joining us today, Kay.
My pleasure.
Dr. Ranjit Singh is researcher, AI on the Ground initiative at the Data and Society Research Institute. Ranjit explores the intersection of data infrastructures, global development, and public policy. Ranjit, you're currently working on a project to map concepts and keywords and curate everyday stories centered on living with data and AI in and from the majority world. Now, I'll leave it to you to talk about this phrase majority world, but Ranjit and I have had a number of really interesting conversations about how to reframe thinking on data and AI. And so pleased to have you here with us, Ranjit.
Thank you for having me here. So excited about this report. It was a really enjoyable read. It's long, but it's really enjoyable.
It's quite a tome, I think. Mark and I have been joking that we need to turn this into a proper book because it's 180 pages in report form. And I'm just so exhausted from it, honestly. But I'm glad you found it a good read, Ranjit. At least that's one person. All right, we're just going to have a conversation here. And I'll start off with some questions for both Kay and Ranjit. Kay, there's a general sense in the developing world, which you've also worked in, that digital technologies are the key to accelerating the economy and economic activity. As a result, there's both this ambition as well as drive and urgency underpinning many of the policies surrounding data, digital, and everything tech related. We certainly see this in Southeast Asia, and our report draws this out across all 5 countries. But as in many parts of the world, including here in the US, that adoption of data-driven technologies like AI often outpaces the norms, the rules and standards of these technologies. Is this something, this race for data, all things data, also a phenomenon that you've observed in your work? And what are the pitfalls that we should be aware of with this exuberance for digital transformation?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you this morning and help launch this report. Completely agree with Ranjit. It is very impressive work, both quality and quantity. So a great resource, especially for people like me, because I don't work in Southeast Asia. I work primarily in South Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a great view into another part of the world. But I was reflecting on both of your opening remarks about how you could have been talking really about anywhere in the world. I mean, these problems are you know, these challenges, these complexities are very universal. And I would take your question a step further and say it's not often that our tools and policies and regulatory frameworks are behind technology. It's always, all the time. And the gap is growing at, you know, at an exceptional, I would say, daily pace. And, you know, as we were discussing earlier, it's it's extraordinary to me that I think we don't have the institutions, we don't have even the vocabulary to be able to talk about how to fairly, equitably govern data and digital systems. And I think that's really problematic because we're just at the beginning of this digital era. And what we're already seeing, 20 years in or so, is the amount of power that is embodied by the people that are running technologies because they're embedding rules in code, right? And in platforms, and by the groups that are able to capture data, right? From all sorts of different sources, but mostly about people, right? Of course, there are many sensors. The whole Internet of Things too is also producing huge amounts of data. But it's getting increasingly more difficult to say that there's anything, frankly, that's not personal data, because I think the lines and the technology is blurring so quickly that that what may have seemed 5 years ago unrelated to a person, a family, a business, in fact, probably does contain some sorts of insights about people. And so I think there's a real challenge facing all of us. And putting aside just the kind of political competition right now, which I think is also just very much starting to take off. And I imagine Southeast Asia, much like the countries I work with in Africa, are feeling quite in the middle of this emerging tech Cold War that they really, really, really don't want to choose sides, right? And so I couldn't agree with your premise more that lower and middle income countries need to be able to be part of the conversation, if not on a global standard setting body, because I think that the global norms are frankly not going to work. We already have the splinter nets, right? But I would love to see a much stronger emphasis in regional bodies on talking about this. This is something that the AU is spending quite a bit of time on. And I think the race for data, is absolutely the right term. And, I don't know, I kind of blame the economist, right? 5 years ago, the data is the new oil, right? Like, especially with post-colonial countries, that kind of extractive resource scramble language, I think, has really taken hold and is one of the reasons that you do feel this urgency, not only around economic development and meeting social and developmental goals, but more and more, there's a sense that data is a almost tangible asset that is being exploited, taken away and monetized. And, that's not wrong, right? We have, when you look at Africa, 80% of the data produced on the continent of Africa is monetized by US platforms, 18% by Chinese platforms, and 2% by European platforms. Almost nothing, although there are in the last couple of years some unicorns there. But it presents a real challenge, but also a real opportunity for governments to think about what the right strategy is rather than trying to copy and paste the other sort of models. And what you see a lot in Africa is kind of an attempt to copy and paste like a GDPR light. And that's happening in for a desire to be compliant, of course, and also big multilateral institutions have often conditioned loans and grants on the adoption of data protection frameworks, the establishment of data protection authorities. But my sense is that while GDPR does a great job of delineating rights for users, it's not necessarily. It was not written for African context, right? It presumes a very high level of legal infrastructure to be able to enforce things. And it doesn't, and even for all the good things GDPR does now, it doesn't really get to the equity principle that you talked about, right? Which is how to make, it does get to the do no harms and be able to address, be forgotten. but it does not get to the idea of equity, and that people should be benefiting more directly from the data that they are co-producing and is being produced about them online. So I think that's a big part of this urgency. But sorry, very long-winded answer to your question. Yes, the scramble for data is it's very real. It's felt very urgently, and there's a sense that that lower and middle income countries need to be at the table, but there's no real table to be at.
Right.
So that's the problem right now.
Right. Or there's a separate table to the side, right?
Right.
It's like a kid's
Exactly.
table.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ranjit, I saw you nodding vigorously. And
I'm sorry about the angle here. I feel very rude, Ranjit.
It's okay.
Like,
It's okay.
I literally have my back to you.
Kay mentioned that we don't even have the vocabulary to talk about some of these topics now. And you were such a great expert resource during this report writing process. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your work on this idea of the majority world and some of the language or discourse that's going on in many parts of the world, i.e. this majority world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to talk to all of you. So broadly speaking, I think to answer the question in the first, extent of thinking about what does it mean to actually think about race towards data in a way, it's kind of, when I started thinking about it, I was kind of focused on what are the different ways in which the notions that people talk about when they basically talk about contending with data and AI, and what is the conceptual vocabulary of the ways in which these issues are addressed in different parts of the world. Interestingly, if you kind of notice the difference in language, the United States and Europe, more often than not, when they think about these tools and data in general, they're thinking about it through the conceptual vocabulary of fairness, transparency, accountability, explainability, and now increasingly contestability. And all of these to a certain extent imply that there's this particular way in which data and AI is kind of looked at as tools that are under human control, and we can basically make them fair, we can make them transparent, we can make them accountable. Now, if you kind of take a step back and look at the rest of the world, where the majority of the population of the world lives, and that's why I kind of use the term majority world in general to address countries that are usually talked about in terms of the global South. The conceptual vocabulary of people who are kind of working in this space and thinking about these issues are kind of focused on extractivism, surveillance, social protection, colonialism, and all of these different ideas are fundamentally based on the notion of thinking about what does it mean to live with data and these tools rather than actually being in control of them in a way, right? And that distinction is an important one to think with and work out in the context of how we are imagining the race for data as well. So there is a lot of conversation to some extent, which is kind of focused on the idea that we are getting left behind. We need to catch up with mature economies in order to basically figure out what data can do for our economies in a way. And that to a certain extent lends itself into a variety of different ways in which we kind of just invest in data without actually first thinking about, is it really an appropriate tool in this particular moment? One of the stories that comes to my mind when I was doing research on this topic in India was basically one of the activists kind of was talking about how health workers in at the local on the ground health workers who work on malnutrition in India have been given iPads to basically record data on children and basically track their health over the first couple of years of their lives. And the interesting thing about this particular exercise is that they have iPads, but they don't have a weighing machine, right? And in that particular shift, what we notice is that while an iPad will be useful to document data, a weighing machine would be much more useful to actually get a sense of what accurate data might look like in a way, right? So there is always this particular intention. Hi, say hi to my cat. There's always this particular intention which is kind of centered on, if we just invest in digitalization, we will solve problems. But at the same time, there's a context in which all of this happens. And sometimes we kind of miss out on what is it that this data is trying to tell us? How do we actually collect it? How do we actually use it? So, I kind of look at it more as a problem of how do we actually start thinking about data as an underlying infrastructure or foundation, as you've been talking about, for a lot of variety of activities, which are increasingly, kind of changing because of the fact that, data is increasingly becoming a part of the way in which these practices are actually organized. So even if before we actually think about regulations, how do we think about the social work practices that are fundamentally changing because of the fact that data is increasingly becoming a part of the way in which we interface with technology is an important part of the question. Back to you, Elina.
Great, thank you. Yes, of course.
Yeah, I think just to jump in on what Ranjit has mentioned about, are we looking into investing into digitalization in terms of that? Just give iPads and that will solve the problem. And one of the key informants and interviews that we did in Singapore is that during the pandemic, there was a provision of these this digital tools and devices. But one of the informants actually mentioned that rather than using digital access as this buzzword, there is a reframing that the word should be adopted is digital equity. Because at the end of the day, you can have access to all these iPods and MacBook Pro, the latest models and all that. But if, for instance, the parents of those students doesn't have the digital, knowledge to manage these devices, the social and, Singapore, to its credit, has its own digital competency framework, in terms of how to create, engage with digital tools. But what the value or the relevance of reframing the conversation from digital access of just having have and have nots into digital equity puts more sort of pressure on how governments and policymakers can think about interventions that considers, again, the conversation beyond the technology, beyond the tangibles, but onto the more of the sort of socio-technical aspects that requires to really manage these types of tools and devices. I think I'll stop there.
Ranjit, I think the juxtaposition that you brought up between how technology is thought about in the global north, if you will, minority world, and in the majority world, this juxtaposition between controlling data on the one hand and living with data on the other hand is really something that we haven't fully thought about in Southeast Asia. And you see this reflected in some of the terms that you mentioned: explainability, accountability, transparency. Those are all being copied and pasted, if you will. And I don't mean this in a derogatory fashion, because it's convenient, it's there, and it makes for easy reach. But when we superimpose that onto our realities, our contextual realities in Southeast Asia, given our diversity, given our social dynamics, it might not always work, because the translation of some of these terms, we're talking about vocabulary and language, sometimes makes for a very awkward fit. You have very community-driven societies that don't really understand why there has to be privacy or the protection of data, because everybody needs to know about everybody else, because that's the way communities know about each other and protect each other. And so explaining this at the ground level, these concepts that make sense to us in the English-speaking world that have access to technology, sometimes doesn't work on the ground level. And these are very real examples of challenges in countries like my own, in Malaysia. I've heard stories about this as well. And I know from our conversation, Ranjit, that this also happens in India. And Kay, you might also agree or not, because you've worked in India as well.
I have, yes.
And so I'd like to turn back to you, Kay, because you have worked in government, you've worked in these places, so you straddle both the global north and global south, as I think all of us do on this panel. How is it that, what's the way to shape capacity building initiatives in a way that preserves and empowers this agency and autonomy in countries in the majority world, to use Ranjit's phrase, rather than to basically say, here's a solution, do what you will with it?
Yeah, and I have to say, this is the thing that I love the most about working in digital development, right? Because this is a field that is so new and it's new for every country in the world, right? So it's not this patriarchal, like, we in the global north figured this out 100 years ago, and all you have to do is copy, paste, maybe do a little adapt, and then, you're on your way. This is, as I said earlier, I would even go further than what you just said about, and Ranjit said, I don't think that the explainability, the transparency, I don't think that works in the so-called global north either, to be honest. It's not working anywhere. If you think about my sort of favorite example is informed consent, right? All the I agree buttons that we click. I mean, if you look back in legal history, the idea of consent was to try to right a power imbalance between two parties, right? And this is just so farcical, this I agree, right? Because you're just actually embedding the power and making it, somehow more legal and more official by clicking I agree every time. And so these concepts are not working anywhere. Which makes this so much more of a two-way conversation than a one-way conversation. And what we have found, in fact, what I really observed coming out of a year-long sabbatical in India, I was in Bangalore with the team that had designed a lot of the digital public infrastructure there, from the digital identity to a payments layer, and some very interesting experiments now around data exchange, which I'd love for us to talk about a little bit, because I think it's the most exciting thing happening anywhere right now. But what we've seen is that countries want to talk to each other about and learn from each other, right? And so based on this experience of India, where we saw delegations of policymakers and technologists come through and try to understand some of the concepts and the design choices that the Indians were making, that kind of peer-to-peer interaction, rather than the more traditional capacity building, I think is so critical. You mentioned earlier that the Digital Impact Alliance, where I work, DIAL, we co-host, along with Smart Africa and the UN Economic Commission for Africa, a growing peer network called the Africa Data Leadership Initiative. And it has become this kind of wildly popular place for digital policymakers at the practitioner level to be able to talk to each other, not only across borders, but sometimes across ministries and sectors, right? And so I think the more we can do to create these kind of fora for exchange, to capture those lessons, to use frameworks like the principles that you outlined at the beginning of your talk, Mark, to kind of ground those. And maybe, I love your dignity by design. Maybe that's, we keep tripping up because all of a sudden we're not allowed to say democracy, right? So we have to find all sorts of words instead of democracy. But I think that really is a nice attempt to capture it. But so if you have these fora where people can talk about shared challenges and hear each other's experiences around a set of, values or norms, I think that's enormously powerful, and probably more so than the traditional capacity building technical assistance models of old.
Yeah. Well, I'm obviously agree, because that's what we advocated in the report.
Excellent.
Ranjit, any thoughts, concrete examples that you can give from your own work and research on this issue?
Absolutely. I think there is, Kathleen is absolutely right in pointing out that, this is clearly, an issue of thinking about and working out what does it mean to actually see what is out there in the world as a way to basically articulate, okay, how do we think about data protection? And GDPR, to a certain extent, allows us to basically then imagine what data protection would look like in different parts of the world, because of the fact that it kind of becomes one of these standards to think with and work out. But at the same time, as she mentioned, a lot of these issues haven't been resolved yet, in the sense that one of the core parts of your report kind of talks a lot about data breaches, and one of the interesting parts about this particular issue is that even in the United States, it's not really figured out how to actually think of data breach as a harm. You can't take data breach to court as a way to basically articulate, that I have been harmed by this party which lost my data. So how do we actually think about data breaches in broadly? It's just an open question. Along these lines, I was also wondering about how Gojek, to a certain extent, has this deep relationship with the kind of ways in which we start thinking about labor laws. And because a lot of the countries in the majority world are fundamentally based on informal economies, the ways in which labor works in all of these countries is fundamentally very different. So, it's kind of a way of formalizing the informal economy through data, which is increasingly becoming a part of our imagination, as well as the way in which we think about what would we need in order for these systems to actually work such that there is due process when things go wrong, right? So these are open questions, these are unresolved questions, and I don't think that there are clear solutions that we can actually look at and then just incorporate in our own context in a way. But beyond that, I think there is also this value in thinking about, whenever we kind of take on, for example, any kind of policy. GDPR is a classic case here. So, there are two ways of thinking about it. Are we overfitting in the context of, oh, we need to have a policy, let's take something and basically fit our context into it? And the other part of it would be simultaneously be thinking about, are we underfitting in a way, right? That, because of the fact that, there are a lot of cultural specific things are simply not accounted for in the way in which these regulations are being made or being taken on and worked out. How do we actually basically say that this regulation would work for a country like Singapore or Indonesia, right? So, it's a simultaneous challenge of thinking about not only what these regulations are at a global scale, but also then what does it mean for an individual country to take them on and think about, okay, how do we, one, interface our businesses with the rest of the world? That's the first problem. And second, how do we interface, our, work in the context of the country in which we operate? And these are two fundamentally different questions, which might actually lead us to very different directions of thinking about research as well.
Did you want to jump in, Mark, or are you good?
Yeah, I think just to emphasize on a big core of the report is really this notion of how local actors can really influence global norms and standards in terms of AI and data. And we see in our consultation with various stakeholders that at least in part of Singapore, there is this community-driven approaches where the unusual suspects are, at least given a space in the table. But at the end of across the 5 sort of case studies, and this is builds on what Kay has mentioned about turning these challenges into opportunities. A lot of the indigenous AI solutions that were designed specifically in one of the countries like Thailand were conceived of because of the challenges that they face. For instance, in Thailand, they have this AI application called Vaja. And it's a text-to-speech application that was designed locally in Thailand because of the peculiarities of the sort of nuances of the Thai language. So it was an indigenous sort of local innovation to cater to the local needs of the population. And how does that local perspective feeds into sort of the global stage where you have Silicon Valley engineers and coders thinking about Alexa and all these Siri and all these prevailing and dominant technology platforms thinking about local context. And I think that sort of Vaja and another one, a platform called Cyberbrain, looks into the power of the community in shaping these AI applications that really suits their needs. And sends back a feedback in tech developers and policymakers in DC and also those in Silicon Valley or in Shenzhen in China about how they conceive of technologies from that sort of local and global context.
And you see the same example in Vietnam as well. Voice assistant was introduced by some of the US big tech companies, but it wasn't working right because even though it was in Vietnamese, it didn't account for the regional differences and dialects of Vietnam. And so a local Vietnamese company decided to come up with its own voice assistant program that accounted for these different regional dialects in the country. And it worked much better because it was a local solution. But I guess the question is, and this gets to Ranjit's point and Kay, your earlier point about seeing more local or regional innovations, is that going to sit at odds with some of the global norms that we have out there? Kay.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that there are global norms anymore, to be honest. I mean, I would say that the Chinese approach to how you regulate the rules around data is very different from obviously Europe. It's very different from the United States, which doesn't regulate data at all.
Apart from California in some states, right?
Right. But, you know, I love Ranjit's phrase about the majority world, because while we often frame this thinking about the US, Europe with GDPR and China, I would point us back to India, where I feel like some of the most exciting innovation is happening. And they are setting their own norms, which are really meant to promote, when they have an advantage, right, of looking back at less developed or more developed, earlier developed digital economies and seeing the problems, the market concentration, the kind of data capture, the surveillance, you know, whether by corporations or by governments. And so they're able to kind of design for the types of digital economy and digital interactions they want. And it's really interesting in terms of really trying to think about how do you not just say equity and agency on paper, but how do you think about like a techno-legal approach to creating data fiduciaries that are automated, right? But that really enable individual consumers to have real control over their data and to benefit directly from it. This experiment is starting right now in the financial services sector. And so the easiest kind of parallel we have to the West is this idea of open banking, right? But it really is this ability to have the data of your transactions generated wherever, whether it's your bank account or through a payments app, to be able to say, I have control of this and I can, if I choose, open it up to a marketplace to be offered other financial services. And they're doing the same thing with decentralized platforms around the kind of gig economy work, right? To try to prevent the inevitable onslaught of the big platform companies, from the West and from China. But I guess it's a long way of saying now that I think that there are norms that are coming out of unusual places because of a failure of the global system to work. And I would love to see bodies like ASEAN, to see the G20 doing much, much more around creating these spaces, and especially the regional economic communities.
Right. Well, that's a cue for Indonesia, right? Which
Yeah.
is the G20.
Yes, exactly.
And Indonesia has such great diversity, 17,000 plus islands, probably an uncountable number of ethnicities and sub-ethnicities and languages and dialects and colloquialism. How are all those differences going to be taken into account? So I'm not going to call anyone out, but I know there are Indonesian representatives in this room. Hopefully ASEAN can take up that challenge. Ranjit, I'd love to get your thoughts on whether this fragmentation, if you will lead to something more significant in rather, not to be over dramatic, but a collapse of the system as we know it now, in terms of norms and standards and laws. And is that necessarily a bad thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, there are two parts to this problem. One is, of course, the idea that, more often than not, data tends to represent existing norms in a society, right? And to some extent, that that can easily challenge the way in which we imagine our society to be in the future, right? So there's one part of this challenge, which is fundamentally about how do we actually produce as well as construct data which kind of is representative of the kind of society that we want to live in. A very simple example of this would be that, traditionally for the really longest period of time, identity documents have only had two categories for gender, male or female, which clearly does not account for a lot of minorities which are very different gender identity, right? So in a way, part of the challenge here is also to think about, okay, how do we actually take a step forward in thinking about what is the kind of data that we need to produce in order to kind of produce the world that we want to live in, right? And the other part of it is to remember that by extension, this also means that, just the process of how we build these technologies, building on case example of, how India is basically thinking about some of these issues, is even the design of these technologies can be policy making by other means, right? It's basically very fundamentally grounded in the idea that, oh, if we design technology in a purposeful way, we can basically sideline some of the issues of regulation by simply designing technologies that do not allow certain things to happen or allow for certain things to happen. One of the interesting features of the way in which the Indian system works, especially the identity system, is that it has so many decentralized silos for data collection when it comes to its identity verification, that it's simply impossible to create a surveillance state by its, in its current design itself, right? Of course, there is a possibility that you can converge, and there's always a possibility of data convergence. But at the same time, the way in which they're kind of the designers of the biometric project are currently imagining this project, it seems like they're kind of purposefully thinking about what would it take for data to be distributed in such a way that you cannot actually make collation, you turn data collation into an infrastructural problem, which will have its own regulatory consequences in itself. So that brings me to the larger question that you're asking about, the kind of fragmentation that is happening across in the world about how people individually imagine what data can do for their economies in different nation states. And I think, there is clear opportunities here in terms of, for example, Indonesia has a great case for thinking about how to regulate super apps. Right, that is one phenomena that is a very Asian phenomena in a general sense. China is very has been producing quite a few super apps. India has been producing super apps. Asian countries have produced super apps, but this is kind of a new thing when it comes to Europe and America. They have their own big tech companies, but at the same time, there's no such thing as a super app, as an example that I can currently think of. So, there are ways by which we can actually think about how, the data capture and collation is happening in different parts of the world. And there are different tendencies of how, these business models come together, which in itself kind of creates its own set of challenges when it comes to thinking about what would it look like to regulate these technologies at a nation level, right? So clearly there is an issue here of sovereignty and how we actually imagine what data means within a particular territory. But at the same time, it's also a global phenomenon, right? So you're constantly kind of struggling between this particular notion of, okay, how do we actually make our, practices not only align with whatever the standard might be at a particular moment of time globally, and what these standards look like at a global level. But at the same time, the last thing that I would mention is that sometimes we tend to actually look at principles as a way to basically say that if we have principles, we have solved the problem, and principles tend to unfortunately end up becoming checklists. So then there is also this challenge of how do we actually enact the way in which we are thinking about these larger principles of how to regulate these technologies into action, and that would always be local in a way. So, while we may have broad global principles around how to regulate AI and data, what their manifestations would look like on the ground would be peculiar, local, and would be country specific. And that's how I think the broader imagination of what AI regulation would look like for the next couple of years, at least, would, turn out to be in a way.
Thank you.
And I'd like to just follow up on that point, because I think, Ranjit, what you're saying about the ability to embed some of these norms into technology is really interesting. And in my world, there's a big emphasis right now on a handful of open source technology solutions, right, that provide sort of society-wide, economy-wide functions, very much modeled on kind of the India stack approach. But they're built with some safeguards in them, and a lot of governments seem to find this appealing because the code is open, they can see the code, and it helps them avoid kind of the vendor lock-in of proprietary systems. But what I'm really waiting to see is if at some point governments that maybe aren't so keen about being unable to do certain things with their identity systems, with their payments infrastructure, at what point that will become more of a negative from, the adoption point of view than a positive.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I want to open it up to members of the audience in the room, but also online. If you have any questions online, somebody will read that out. You have a question, Emily? Not yet, okay. I want to encourage those online again to use the hashtag Asia Society Live if you have an intervention, or if not, we have a mic for the gentleman up here.
Hi, my name is Max Scott. Thank you all for this great presentation today. One question I had was reflecting on the comment that was made earlier that a lot of developing and middle income countries need to be at the table, but there's not necessarily a table to be had. And what struck me is that for another general purpose technology that had a socio-technical impact, there are multi-stakeholder forums for discussion, like at the Internet Governance Forum. But there's no such forum for artificial intelligence where developing countries can have these kinds of multi-stakeholder discussions. So my question is sort of two parts. One, are those types of fora useful? And would a multi-stakeholder fora like the Internet Governance Forum for technology like AI be useful? And two, what is the role of the private sector in engaging on some of these issues and encouraging more of these multi-stakeholder conversations? Thank you.
I'm going to let our guests respond to that first before Mark and I chip in. Maybe Ranjit, I'll start with you.
I think that's a great question. It also kind of brings up this issue of how we start to think about, okay, what would it mean to actually have a conversation across a global conversation on this issue? I personally feel that the way in which the internet governance has happened over the last, 20 years, 25 years, it's been phenomenal in terms of, the way in which we've been able to build consensus, and we've been able to basically, figure out a way by which we can actually keep the basic architecture of internet to be, sustainably open in many ways. There is a lot at stake here when it comes to AI, which kind of relates to the second question that you're asking, which is kind of focused on how we start thinking about what would governance models look like for AI systems in general, primarily because, a lot of this technology is proprietary. And we really don't know what's going on often because there's a perceived as well as emergent lack of documentation which is available publicly to actually understand why certain systems behave the way they do, right? So at a broader level, you're absolutely right in pointing out that openness is certainly necessary in order to have a global conversation on this issue. How we actually achieve that is unfortunately a more complicated issue, because it would involve not only people coming together and being open to the idea of, rather than just simply saying that, oh, we need regulation, there has to be a way by which we can start thinking about, okay, if we all agree that there has to be some kind of regulation, what is the right way of, one, enacting that regulation, and second, enforcing that regulation in the first place, right? And that's why, to a certain extent, there's a whole conversation that is currently happening around impact assessments and how do we actually incorporate the way in which algorithmic systems need to be evaluated for their impact before they're actually deployed in the world. And I think that clearly creates the need for some of this open documentation and some of these conversations to be opened up, which then allows for certain kinds of these models to actually work in the first place, right? I would say that the first challenge here is basically having access to documentation to be able to actually continue and think through some of these conversations and build out a model of governance which is based on access to information in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I would only add, and I agree, it's a great question. I think the Internet Governance Forum and the governance structures of the early internet are, I don't think it's possible to recreate those around data and AI. I think it's now too much understood as core to national security, to economic competitiveness, that I think it would be hard to get agreement on, the same ways that we did with ICANN and the early kind of utopian days before anyone really understood the power of the internet. So I don't mean to be super pessimistic there. But if you look at even just the United States and the EU trying to have conversations over how to regulate data, those can't really, I mean, those have been unable to make much progress in the last few years too. So then when you start going into far, more different approaches, it's, it's hard to imagine, frankly. And, if you want to see how the politics of this play out in real time, watch the election at the United Nations Internet ITU for the Secretary General. It's turning out once again to be a contest between the US and China. And so there is a struggle for these forums, but it's hard to imagine that one will come up, which is why I'm really a proponent of regional approaches, because I think different regions need to be at their own table as well.
Private sector?
Oh, private sector. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a huge role for the private sector. But speaking very, very frankly here, and this is my own capacity rather than representing Dial, it's there need to be more fora for experimentation with private sector. I think we've gotten here in the US so bogged down with push and pull against regulation that we've lost that ability to kind of see if there's some experimentation we can do. And there are a lot of great examples of that too, coming out of Singapore in particular. They're doing great kind of sandbox type work with the private sector. And I really appreciate that type of public-private partnership to be able to figure out the rules of the road rather than having it be this, very controversial, you're either pushing an industry perspective and basically don't want anything but watered down regulation, or you're trying to dismantle and, do all sorts of things that maybe would hurt American competitiveness. I don't know.
I think just to answer the question about how do we devise sort of like a new forum for AI, I think the ambitious sort of side of us designing the playbook is really for this to become the foundation of an ASEAN AI forum in the future.
Yeah.
I think that's really the high bar. That's why we came up with the 5 principles, that this isn't just about 5 recommendations. And we see the playbook elements and the recommendations, the principles and the practices to be as evolving sort of principles in the future. They are not static. They are a reflection of the experiences of the 5 country case studies. And if Elina and I will be more ambitious, aside from turning it into a book, we hope that this becomes the foundation of ASEAN when it talks about AI in the future, and as building on what Kay has mentioned about having a regional approach. And I think this is really the reality in the region with the trends of deglobalization, with the United States turning more inward. I think more countries in the middle will have a checkered kind of different sort of regulations. As Kay has mentioned, the table, we can't find the table. There is no table. So countries will pick and choose, which is also a trend that we now see in Southeast Asia. I think that's on your first question. The second question would be the role of private sector. There's been a lot of upbeat participation in Southeast Asia private sectors. Microsoft is there working with Malaysia. Microsoft has worked with Mahidol University in coming up with the AI ethics framework with in Thailand. And I think Alibaba and Tencent are also key sort of actors in terms of Indonesia's super apps, Gojek and Tokopedia. And so we see this engagement of the private sector. But I think at the heart of our paper, where we see the role of private sector, is really cultivating that sort of gender participation among young learners in terms of STEM. Because at this, I mean, we advocate in the publication about representation of Southeast Asian countries in ISO and standard setting bodies. But what we also see is like 10 years, as Elina said, 10 years, 50 years down the line, how do we increase more Southeast Asians becoming adept in, not just taking selfies or doing TikTok videos, but really becoming the coders and the engineers of this next generation. So like I said, this is not just about in the near term of putting someone from Indonesia, Vietnam in the ISO, but really the next generation of engineers, linguists, and historians being part of this technical or policy setting body. So I'll stop there.
I also want to emphasize that having a seat at the table is not enough if you bring the same mindset to the table, right? And so this tagline of DEI that we all become so accustomed to here in the US that diversity of thought is very, very important. Because if Southeast Asians go to the international table and basically say the same things without really bringing their own contextual perspectives to the discussion, then what's the point? Standard setting bodies like ISO, there's been no senior Southeast Asian representative apart from the last one, who's a Singaporean, and that was a few decades ago. And I heard from conversations as part of this report that it's a very technical exercise that a lot of less mature countries, less technologically mature countries are not yet prepared for. So I think this is kind of where capacity building comes in, but capacity building is space, right? Because you have to have that space that allows for those local narratives, local context to really infuse into the conversation. If it's just capacity building from a technical standpoint that's based on other models, I mean, that's useful, yes, but is it really going to further some of the priorities, needs, and agency of those other countries in the majority world? So I hope that kind of gets at your first sets of responses. Sorry to overwhelm
Thanks,
you
Max.
guys. Thank you. Anybody else in the audience like to jump in? Go ahead, John, and then Shay.
Thank you. I'm John Brandon. I'm with the Asia Foundation. Congratulations on this report. I'm a bit struck on the when you talk about data and data protection. I remember about 5-6 years ago reading that the low levels of investment in data protection by companies in ASEAN overall, has that improved over the last 5 or 6 years? And I take your point about the challenge of trying to lift all boats within ASEAN. I mean, I think you were right in terms of focusing on these countries. Maybe perhaps you could have included the Philippines, but aside from that, I mean, the other countries are really much lower in terms of level of the digital economy than the ones that you worked on. So thank you.
Thank you. These 5 countries really killed us over there with me anyway over the past year. So we'll save the Philippines and the others for the next phase, hopefully. Ma, do you want to say anything about data protection?
Yeah, I mean, in the Philippines, I think data protection is really enforced and in place. I think it has, compared to the other ASEAN countries, it has one of the strictest sort of enforcement, because I think it covers the sort of other sensitive members of the government, and it has a very sort of, in a way, very close sort of relationship in terms of its nature with Singapore and how it thinks about data protection. In terms of AI, there's still no sort of framework or an ethical AI framework. They have a roadmap of it, but there is definitely an increasing public-private partnerships occurring in the Philippines. And if we try to revise and look at this and turn it into a formal publication, I think the Philippines will definitely be one of the sort of case studies that will also include as one of the digitally mature countries in the region.
So on data protection, the answer is yes and no. You see in the report that there have been a number of data breaches even in the last couple of years. And maybe that's not surprising because we've all been working from home over the pandemic. But the magnitude of these data breaches have really been quite staggering. You've had massive data breaches in Malaysia, in Indonesia.
That's a data breach.
That's an audio breach. But on the one hand, yes, there's more awareness about some of these risks and vulnerabilities. But on the other hand, you don't really see a concerted effort to really do anything about it. And part of that is a resource and capacity issue. The other part of that is just a lack of appreciation for how far down the line the implications are of these data breaches. And I think this goes back to some of what both Kay and Ranjit were talking about in terms of the vocabulary and our lack of—
I was just going to say that because
Right.
people conflate cybersecurity as well with other aspects of data protection.
Right.
Yeah.
And this idea of privacy, well, it's, I don't have anything to hide. If you have my address, if you have my contact details, doesn't really matter to me. But Kay, do you want to expand on what you just said?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have anything much more to say, but but it does seem that people use the same language in this sector to mean very different things, right? And so, well, of course, cybersecurity is very related to protecting people from having their personal data misused against them. They are different, can be related, but they are different. And you know, it seems to me that, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, like there are fewer and fewer types of data that can be considered non-personal.
Right.
And so, yes, you're right. You can have your address out there, and who really cares? We used to all have our addresses in the white pages, right?
Yes.
But what we didn't have is our HIV status, you know, collected by health workers with their iPads in India and fed into God knows where, you know, with what protections. I mean, it was really instructive for me to look under the hood more at Aadhaar, at the Indian national identity system, because there were the time that I was in India in 2018, there was a story after story after story of data breaches of Aadhaar and Aadhaar being used to do all of these terrible things. And when you peel back the, you know, the onion layers, it actually wasn't Aadhaar that was the problem. It was all of the other government databases that were plugging into Aadhaar where these exposures were happening. And, you know, this can have very, very serious implications. So again, getting back to this kind of building in some norms and standards into the technology, I think is really, really important. I mean, one very recent dramatic example was the biometric identity system for the Afghan National Security Forces. Fortunately, the data was built with a kill switch, a self-destruct switch. You know, so there was a huge amount of concern for a couple of weeks that these databases had fallen into the hands of the de facto regime now. But luckily, somebody had thought of that in the design. So.
Yeah, that's an important point that we don't often think about. Again, because in Southeast Asia, we're so focused on the digital economy, we don't think about some of these security implications. Right. Ranjit, did you have anything to add on this point?
Yeah, just very quickly. I think, you know, there's this really nice, useful paper that recently came out, which was about articulating what would it look like to actually think about data breach as a harm. And it kind of broke it down into two components. One was the risk of a potential future harm that might happen because of the fact that, you know, your data has been breached. And the other is the anxiety over it and how anxious you feel because of the fact that your data is out there in the world. The anxiety part is often a result of a certain kind of digital infrastructure literacy, in the sense that you need to be cognizant enough to understand that this is something that could potentially impact you in the future in one way or the other, and what that would look like is unclear at the present moment. But at the same time, that to a certain extent makes it really difficult to actually articulate, you know, what is the future harm of a data breach in this present moment that is happening right now. And that to a certain extent brings me to this, you know, entire question around how do we think about cybersecurity, where, you know, in literature, often cybersecurity, the weakest link in cybersecurity is often the end user. We often place the blame of the systems being insecure to one person somewhere who kind of, you know, had the wrong password, or their password was 1234, basically, right?
Right.
Which is an interesting way of thinking about this problem in terms of, you know, oh, we do recognize that this is how people actually think about passwords. So why are we not incorporating it into the design of the system itself, right? So how do we actually start thinking about these issues of cybersecurity, data protection as simultaneously being issues of speculation in terms of what could potentially happen in the future because of the fact that certain kinds of data were left unprotected in this present moment. And at the same time, the other part of it is that when do we stop passing the blame onto the user of, you know, why certain systems didn't work as they were intended to work in a way. And that to a certain extent brings me to the last point that I want to make. I think there is a way in which we kind of think about practices that have been very crucial to cybersecurity, which can increasingly become very useful to how we think about harms coming from these systems, right? So there's a recent report that came out from the Algorithmic Justice League, which is kind of focused on the idea of how we can use the model of the bug bounty in order to basically identify harms of systems that basically use machine learning or artificial intelligence, right? So bug bounties is a very typical cybersecurity resilience model of thinking about how to make these systems more resilient. And we can easily have a very similar system that we can incorporate to start thinking about AI harms.
So I would just say that I would bet, I have no data to back this up, but I would bet that there's been a lot more harm to people by the misuse of data that didn't occur from a breach, but was, just by who controlled the data.
Yeah, that's a really
Right?
interesting point. Yeah.
Cambridge Analytica was not
Yes.
a breach,
Yes,
right?
exactly. And we willingly signed on to those
Mhm.
terms of service, right?
Right.
We only have a few minutes left. Shay, you had a question?
Sure. Hi, I'm Shay Wester. My question relates to looking at kind of some of the common threads or differences that you saw within the countries in Southeast Asia. They have different data protection regimes, some more established than others. And do those differences or similarities mean something for a potential AI forum within ASEAN as you're trying to establish some sort of regional norms or approaches? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to let Mark take that, and then I will turn back to Kay for any final thoughts you have, Ranjit, and then I'm going to close this off. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I think in terms of the common threads, there is a growing consciousness and awareness, at least from the user's perspective in Southeast Asia. Singapore, I mean, across the 5-country case studies, I think in the local communities, they are now realizing, ASEAN, Southeast Asians are realizing the value of privacy, which is, I think, is not really in the mainstream conversation or discourse over the past couple of years. And I think because of that acceleration of awareness on data privacy and protection, more and more becoming, in a way, skeptical about about their own government. I won't mention any sort of specific country, about how certain cybersecurity laws can be used to sort of surveil for surveillance purposes, and how these can be weaponized that could infringe further. But also, I think a common thread as well is that people are now realizing that Southeast Asia is at least economically becoming stronger. That what are the trade-offs, as Elina has mentioned? Why do we optimize? What are the trade-offs of adapting digital technologies? And the trade-offs of these are like this self-actualization questions about my personal space and identity. So I think that's a common thread that is now arising sort of in the region. I think divergence is more on sort of the priorities of each country. I think their direction in terms of shaping their ethical AI frameworks are becoming regional, but at the same time there is that part of the equation that they are continuously reflecting on the local needs of the people.
Okay, final thoughts.
Yeah, nothing earth-shattering, but I love the proposal for the ASEAN AI Forum, and hope that the ASEAN powers that be take note of that. I think it would be a wonderful example for the other economic communities around the world to be able to model some regional cooperation like that.
Excellent. Thank you. Ranjit.
Excellent point, Kay. I completely agree with you. It makes a lot of sense to basically think about it as a region, primarily because sometimes when it comes to the markets of how we think about these systems, they're always kind of compared to populations. And to some extent, there is this whole argument that the India can exert such an influence on the way in which policies work in India, primarily because India is a huge market. It has more than 1.4 billion people. And sometimes it's just the collation of the populations that can easily become a way to actually force and have an impact on policy making, as well as more say. So regional formulations also make sense in that context. The only last thing that I would say is that we should also, to some extent, beyond the larger questions of how we think about these technologies at a broader scale, we should also think about what is the ordinary ethics of using these systems on an everyday basis. What are the stories that we kind of are particularly useful in terms of as being indicative of the kind of challenges that people are facing specifically in these countries, as a way to then articulate what similarity or difference would look like between these countries and how they're imagining the use of these technologies. On that note, in broadly speaking, this move towards thinking about ordinary ethics, as well as thinking about the majority world, is already happening. We are just, I'm just one of those people who are kind of trying to basically invigorate some of this conversation and make it so that we can actually start thinking about living with data, not only as a research problem, but also as a way to actually articulate why these technology, why this moment of thinking of living with data is such an important one for not only the future of these technologies, but also how we imagine the larger resolution of the kinds of problems that these technologies are facing. So focus on ordinary ethics is what I would say.
Great, thanks. And so I think just one minor point to add to Mark's explanation. There is a real enthusiasm for all things digital across all 5 countries, despite the very different capacities and resources. But there was also this keenness to work together to create a more regional perspective or framework or forum. But I think because primarily at the government level, there isn't that time and space to actually do anything about it, hopefully this report will prompt some of that thinking and maybe hopefully galvanize an initiative to actually come together, have those interagency conversations, have those multi-stakeholder conversations in order for us to play a more meaningful role at the global level. So on that note, I want to thank all of you for coming, particularly Ranjit joining us online. Kay, thank you so much for making it here in person. Mark coming all the way from sunny Honolulu, and all of you for being here in person. I do want to give a special thanks to everybody who helped with this report. Some of those folks are in here. They were interning with us at the Asian Society Policy Institute. I see Alicia here. Thank you so much for all your help. Alicia, Arthur, you're in the back. And our current interns, Aslin and Emily, Martin, all this report. We were so happy to receive this because there was so much stress involved in this, but this could not have been possible without your help. So thank you very much. And again, thank you to those of you online who've been tuning in. And hopefully you will be thinking more about some of these issues we've been discussing. Have a great rest of your day.